Hello everyone, and today in this new video of our MIDAS Health Economics series, Luís and I will talk about inferring causality. So I'll start by presenting that problem that Luís described in the video on causality versus correlation, where we had an hypothesis with a new technology applied to a group of smokers. After 5 years, the level of smoking decreased by 20%, while the trends remained constant for people who did not use that technology. And the claim we were assessing in that video was that the new technology was considered a huge success. Of course, there's other details which we need to take into consideration. As Luís was explaining in that video, that's not necessarily true because people might self-select themselves into using the new technology. Also, people might be willing to stop smoking anyway, regardless of whether they are using the new technology or they are not using the new technology. So you can see here that we got a situation where it's difficult to assess causality, the causal link between the new technology and the reduction in the level of smoking. There are different approaches that researchers use to precisely assess this causal link, and we will have a look at some common approaches today. I will talk now about one of the most common approaches, which is a randomized controlled trial. So in a randomized controlled trial, as the name suggests, we have a randomization component where we can allocate the participants randomly to either an intervention group or a control usual care group. We have an example here in this slide, a group of participants, adult smokers. Of course, we might want to include other inclusion criteria like certain age groups, maybe heavy smokers. So that could be, of course, decided by the researchers running the trial. Intervention is the new technology. So you can think about a new nicotine patch, for example. Control is usual care or standard level of care. The outcome we want to measure is, in this case, the number of cigarettes per day, and the period is 5 years. So we can represent this randomized controlled trial. At the beginning, at the baseline, we will measure the number of cigarettes per day smoked by all the participants, and then on average, this could be, let's say, 12 per day. Then we have that random allocation. So that's where we randomly allocate participants to either Group A, new technology, or Group B, usual care. Then the trial takes place, and at the end, the researchers are able to remeasure the outcome, which is the number of cigarettes per day, both for Group A and for Group B, and trying to assess whether there's been a reduction in the level of smoking over time, but also whether there's been a difference in the level of smoking across the two groups, in order to assess the effectiveness of the new technology and to assess that causal link between the new technology and the health outcome. Now, when researchers run randomized controlled trials, they have to consider potential problems, and there are different approaches which help researchers tackling these potential problems. In the research world, these problems are called biases, and we will have a look at some common biases in this slide. So we have the same structure as before, and when the trial starts, we have the random allocation, which helps tackling the selection bias. So with selection bias, we mean you might have more heavy smokers in one group compared with the other. You might have differences in ages, pre-existing conditions across the two groups. Thanks to random allocation, researchers are able to minimize these imbalances and to create a kind of a balance across the two groups. We might encounter other problems linked, for example, to performance bias. You might think that, for example, people allocated to a certain group, by knowing their allocation, they might seek extra care. So, for example, people in Group B, they might go and seek extra care because they know their allocation. Or if you think about the intervention being, for example, a smoking cessation therapy, the therapist running that therapy might decide to give extra care to the people receiving the intervention. Again, that might distort the measurement of the effectiveness of the intervention. How do researchers try to tackle that by blinding the participants, by blinding the people running the intervention as far as possible. There are certain situations, certain contexts where blinding is not feasible, like if you think about a new type of surgery, for example, that it's not really practical to do blinding in that situation. Another problem researchers might need to consider is attrition bias. So where we have different numbers of people dropping out of the trial, it might be that the effectiveness is overestimated if we exclude the data from people who dropped out during the trial for the usual care group, for example. And then at the end of the trial, researchers measure the outcome. In this case, we have a number of cigarettes per day, but there might be also other outcomes which researchers want to take into account. And some of these might be, let's say, subjective. So it's important to blind the assessors in terms of the allocation in terms of the group allocation in order to avoid any bias in assessing subjective outcomes. And then we come to an analysis bit. So in the end, of course, we want to know whether the intervention, the new technology has been effective in reducing the level of smoking. How do we do that? There are, again, different approaches. The one we present here is ANCOVA, which is a form of regression. And if you want to refresh your memory around regressions, I will suggest that you take a look at our video on regressions and predictions that we recorded some time ago. Here we present the regression equation for ANCOVA, where we have the outcome variable or dependent variable, number of cigarettes per day. We consider the intercept A, which is basically the number of cigarettes people will smoke anyway, regardless of whether they've been allocated to usual care or to receiving a new technology. Then the number of cigarettes per day also depends on the treatment group, so whether they receive the new technology or they are allocated to usual care. It depends also on the baseline value. So your starting point will have, in terms of number of cigarettes per day, will have an influence on the final point, on the number of cigarettes you smoke at the end of the trial. And then researchers might want to take into account also other factors which might be linked to the outcome. So age, pre-existing condition, again, this is something that might be decided beforehand, and these factors can be included in the final ANCOVA analysis.
I have a question for you, Valerio. If you have a perfect randomization and you don't have any of the problems that you mentioned before, you need this baseline value or these other factors in the regression?
Yeah, I will say that is still, I think, a good practice to include this, yes, because randomization, of course, can be conducted perfectly, but there are always some kind of imbalances in the level of some socio-demographic factors, clinical factors across the groups. So I will say that's always important, I guess, to control for these factors here, like the baseline value and other factors. So that was my last slide for today. In the next video that Luís will present, he will talk about a situation where it's not feasible to conduct randomized controlled trials, and he will talk about other approaches which can be used to infer causality. So we'll see you at the next video on part 2 of inferring causality. Thank you.
Bye.